Welcome to our half-day conference on examining U.S. India relations. This is year 2 of our Naren Gupta Legacy Series. We have grown this year. This event is sold out, so thank you all for being here and getting your tickets early. We are very pleased to have a wonderful lineup of expert speakers who have traveled to be with us today, who are longtime supporters and friends, and we have Naren Gupta's family members here with us as well. Thank you all for being with us. We have 4 sessions for you today. We're going to cover where we are with U.S. India relations, India's tech corridor and what to expect from the G20, because India is hosting the big leader summit for the very first time later this year. You're going to hear from a tech unicorn CEO, and then we're going to end with something a little different, an interactive exercise on philanthropy. We are so pleased to have with us our board members and our advisory council members. 2 of them are speaking today, Samir Chadha and Dien Nguyen. We also have the head of Thai, Anita Manwani, and the head of India Spora, Amar Rajaswamy. They're going to be with us today. Essentially, we've gathered the who's who of India for all of you, and several folks are with us for the 2nd year. We're going to be doing this, of course, as a tribute to and in inspiration from Naren Gupta. And we're going to be hearing from his Nexus Ventures colleague, Sandeep Singhal, later on as well. All of our speakers, their bios, and our agenda are on our Asia Society Northern California website. You can also get the information by scanning the QR code on our program up here. A big thank you to our sponsors. We could not do it without you. And deep thanks to our fantastic Asia Society team. I'm Margaret Conley, the Executive Director of the Northern California Center. And I just returned from some time off in India, traveling the country from the south in Madurai to Mumbai to Rajasthan and up to Delhi. And you can feel the energy of a country on the rise, the smoother roads and infrastructure. The signs for the G20 are all over the place. There's excitement on U.S. India relations, the visit of the U.S. Defense Minister Lloyd Allen to India last week, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan going this week, and Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to Washington, D.C. next week. I had the chance to meet with the new U.S. Ambassador to India, Eric Garcetti, who has California roots, and he is very excited about being posted there and strengthening U.S.-India ties, and especially at this time, which we're going to be hearing about all of this in much more detail. And for all of our sessions, we do want to have time for Q&A for all of you in the audience. Many of you are experts in your own rights in your industry and field, so we do want to hear from you. Wait for a moderator to call on you when the time is right. A microphone will be brought to you. Please introduce yourself, say your name, and keep your questions brief so we can keep the conversation going and hear from as many of you as possible. This event today is on the record. We are recording. We do have press cameras also in the back of the room. So please take a moment to silence your phones. We're going to wrap today at 5 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started with our keynote overview of U.S.-India relations. To set the stage for us, please welcome Rafiq Dossani. He is the Director for Asia-Pacific Policy for RAND, and he's visiting us from Southern California. We look forward to hearing from him on where we are geopolitically. All eyes are on India, and let's hear it for Rafiq and welcome him to the stage. Rafiq.
Thank you, Margaret. So it's a real pleasure to be here, an honor to be here. Naren Gupta was a friend of mine. It's also nice to be here because I'm meeting a lot of friends from whom I haven't met for about a decade or so in most cases. So that feels very nice. And you said this is a who's who. I hope at least some people will not say who's Rafiq, but they might. So let me start by saying that the general perception of U.S.-India relations is that it is very robust, that it's growing well. If you look at the trade figures, you look at defense sales, you look at business cooperation, look at FDI, all these are on an upward path. And then you have some areas where there is some concern. For example, India's stance on the Ukraine war, for example, and other things. So I think it's interesting the way the dynamics of the relationship are developing. So I'm hoping I can spend some time on that. And finally, sort of look ahead at what's going to happen. You know, for many people, the U.S.-India relationship is partly defined by what's happening with U.S.-China relations. So the impact of that, I think, is worth thinking about. That trajectory is sort of unknown at this point, but you know, there's enough information, I think, to make some conclusions that might be interesting. So if I look at U.S.-India relations over the since the start of this century, clearly it was the nuclear tests by India and then followed by Pakistan that had some significant role in changing U.S. perceptions of India from largely as an economic partner to an economic and a security partner. So you can say that roughly from the year 2000, when President Bush came into power, 2001, there was a change in the attitude to India, where the Bush government said India can be a strategic partner to the United States in the long term. And so we had things like the next steps in strategic partnership being signed. India signed the first military sort of defense collaboration agreement for information exchange, GSOMIA. And so that was a time when, by and large, the US was interested in India from those points of view, that this could be a strategic partner down the road. From India's point of view, things were a little different. They were coming out of a period when India was growing strongly, and there was a feeling that we now need to dehyphenate the relationship with Pakistan. So till then, you can say, till the nuclear tests, and even up to the 2001-2 Kashmir face-off, the US looked on India as sort of jointly with Pakistan, the South Asia concept. And India had been pushing that we want to dehyphenate this relationship. And that was accomplished during that period. So 2000, 2010, with the signing of these agreements, with India opening up more, pretty much by 2010, that dehyphenation had been accomplished. So that was, from India's point of view, that was its goal. It did not see at that point the US as a strategic partner. It did see a long-term future in joining the market economy. But there were many areas where India and the US disagreed at that point. You know, for example, on simple topic of multilateralism, there was a sense that India said, you know, we want to be a great power, and being a great power means being multilateral. The US's view of multilateralism was quite different. So I'll come to some of that a little later. But let me go to the next phase, which was a shorter period of 2010 to 2015. I mean, these are rough dates with lots of overlaps, where where India was at the point where it wanted to grow stronger in terms of national security. So there was a big interest in India in acquiring US technology on the defense side. So those 5 years were a strong period of focus on defense cooperation, which was welcomed by the US. But one of the conditions of the US was you have to step up your purchases of defense equipment as a condition for technology transfer. And India, by and large, complied with that requirement. So by 2011, India had become the largest purchaser of American defense equipment, overtaking the Saudis. So a status that they have kept unto this date. So from a US point of view, they were quite pleased with this. You know, that's time when you started hearing statements like the US-India relationship is the best ever than it's ever been, and that's probably true. But it was from a certain lens of being a good for the US economy in terms of selling defense equipment, as well as being a place where business could be done much more easily than before. So the US, if I was to say, how did the US characterize the relationship? It was different from India. India was saying this is our way to slowly become a great power. And from the US point of view, it was more that we're starting to look at a strategic partnership. So then we moved to 2015 to 18, which was a very interesting period because we had the Modi government in power from 2014. And the Modi government was much more open to pathways to India's greatness. So just to give you a sense of greatness, ambitions, right from the time of Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first Prime Minister, there's always been this ambition stated quite publicly that India's right is to be a global power, but a responsible global power, one that would strongly keep the interests of the global south in mind. So, at that time when Modi came in, he was much more open to different pathways to accomplish that. In particular, he was open to dealing closely with China. So that was a period when the US view of India started becoming more nuanced. I wouldn't say it reduced its expectations of closeness with India, but it became more nuanced. For example, as far as India was concerned, you might recall there was that period when President Xi invited Modi to Wuhan in China, and they set the stage in 2018 for close cooperation on economic issues. Prior to that, there had been the Doklam incident in Bhutan, where India and China had sort of confronted each other, or troops had, but that was sort of managed with this 2018 Wuhan meeting. And at that time, China, Xi Jinping visited Modi before that, committed huge investments to, restructuring India, especially in Indian infrastructure. And so that period, 2015 to 18, was a period of rising India-China economic ties. And the US was observing this with some concern. They had not by then declared China to be a strategic rival. That was to happen only at the end of 2017. But for those 3 years, India did things like it joined the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, as a co-founder. The NDB, or what was called the BRICS Bank originally, was started during that time with India as an equal partner with China, Russia, and Brazil and South Africa. So the BRICS Bank was founded. Then India also stopped all its senior officials from traveling to Arunachal Pradesh, which is disputed territory between India and China, as a gesture to China. So that was a period when India-China ties were rising significantly. And from India's point of view, it made good sense. They saw China as primarily an economic partner, but also down the road as a fellow pole. If you think of a world which has multiple poles, the hope was that they knew that China would be number 2 before India could reach that position, but the hope would be that India would be the third one. All the other contenders for a multipolar world, now of course the US is number 1, Japan, Britain, of course, earlier had dropped off. Japan was a serious contender to that position in the mid-1980s, but with the Plaza Accord of 1987, Japan pretty much gave up those ambitions in return for the US security umbrella. And this, I think, is an interesting development because what it raises is a long-term issue of multipolarity. And we'll come back to that when I discuss the Ukraine situation shortly. But so 2015-18 was a period when India's ties with China were improving strongly. Investments were coming in a big way. Those of you in the venture capital world would recall that time when a lot of Chinese investment went into startups in India, many of which have done very well. And at that point, India also started to be a little concerned about the US because it was not transferring defense technology as promised. So the goal, or the unstated goal had been, if we become a large buyer of US defense equipment, in return we will get technology. But the US companies were unwilling to transfer their defense technology, and that till today remains a concern for India. But that happened during the time when China was coming close to India. And as far as the US was concerned, then I think they made the decision we really need to think of strategic engagement with India. Now, 2019 to 23, or to the present time, is the last period that things started changing fairly dramatically. In 2019, we had the supersession of the Union territories of Ladakh, Jammu and Kashmir as Union territories of India. This was strongly opposed by China, not just to support Pakistan, but it included land in Ladakh that was claimed by China and was disputed territory. The Chinese claimed there was an unstated understanding between India and China that that land would not be occupied, would not be taken over as a Union territory. And the Chinese claimed that their incursion into Ladakh in the next year, in 2020, was driven by what had happened in 2019. But the result of that incursion was it started a huge downward trend in India-China relations. So strategically, India now saw China no longer as a viable pole in the multipolar strategic world. They had always looked to Russia as sort of a second line of balance. That became more prominent during this period, 2019 to 2023. And of course, with the Ukraine war of last year, we are all aware of what happened. So, with India not agreeing with the US position. So let me talk a little bit about that. So from the Indian perspective, in the US, they want to see the US as a strategic partner, which means that, if you think of partnerships, it can take different forms. And it's not that there's a single form for all kinds of activities. But at the least, you'd want to say that, if you can be partners and you coordinate with one another. So you agree that, imagine two ships entering a harbor, one US and one Indian, and then they coordinate to make sure that they don't, hit each other. So that's kind of a coordinating kind of relationship. So each has their own goal, both want to go into that harbor, they make sure it works. Then you could have a cooperative relationship where each has its own goals, but they make sure that they cooperate and support each other. So you might imagine that, say the ship wants to refuel, so India opens up its ports for refueling to US ships, and the US opens up its ports to refueling for Indian ships. So that they still have their own goals. But they cooperate to help each other achieve their own goals. And the third is the closest form, which is collaboration. So in collaboration, we each agree that our goals will be set jointly. So we're willing to give up some goals to satisfy your interests, and you give up some to satisfy our interests, and we agree that the sum is greater than the parts. That is what a strategic relationship is supposed to look like. And with the Ukraine war, there's been great concern on India's side about whether the US is really interested in a strategic relationship, where they're willing to look at India and say, well, we want you to be a great power, which the US has repeatedly said, but on our terms. So that's been, the Ukraine war, I think, especially the way the US handled it was not very good. What happened was when India first refused to support and abstain from the vote in the UN, the US sent diplomat after diplomat, and even prime minister after prime minister. So Kishida went from Japan, Boris Johnson went from England, several US diplomats went, and the language they used was taken very badly by India. They used language like, it's morally right for India to support Ukraine in this war, and if India does not support, there will be consequences. The word consequences is, you don't treat a great power, a would-be great power, one that you believe will be your partner, like that. So India took it very poorly, and the question still remains as to whether the US gets it or not. Most recently you had the Congress inviting India to join NATO. Now that's not something that India would ever do. There's a certain lack of understanding that if a country wants to be a great power, the last thing it'll do is join an alliance led by the US. So defining that relationship is really a problem right now. And I don't know if any of you read Ashley Tellis's recent piece, very perceptive piece, where he points out that when it comes to China, India will never be fully on the side of the US. Now think about it. From an Indian point of view, it has a large land border with China, and since it has a large land border with China, it needs to manage that. And if it makes China into an adversary, a hostile adversary, its land border, the US is not going to come to the help of India and fight a land war with it. The whole Indo-Pacific strategy, which India is part of in a way, but strongly disagrees with, is the maritime component of it. The Indo-Pacific Alliance, from the US point of view, is a maritime alliance. It deals with the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Indian Ocean region. And the Indian point of view is, that's not correct, it ought to be more comprehensive than that. So there are two issues here. One is, what goals are you sharing with me that you're willing to adjust on? You can see that in the functioning of the Quad. So the Quad, as you all would know, is a gathering, is a grouping of India, the United States, Japan, and Australia. Now, from an Indian point of view, the Quad is all about India and the US. Japan and Australia are there for window dressing, because the thinking is Japan and Australia are already so closely aligned with the United States that adding them to the Quad really doesn't bring anything to the table for the US. It's just to show that there's a grouping of 4 democratic countries. And if you see the language of the Quad, however, it strongly reflects the consideration given to India. There's no mention of China in any of the Quad readouts. In fact, you have fairly banal readouts which say we must work on vaccine development, climate change issues. So the only part of the Quad readout that even vaguely deals with China is the need to uphold an international order. So and that's clearly a concession to India. So people like Tellis are saying, if you look at how India behaves towards China, it's very, very careful. It will not provoke China in the way that Japan and Australia are willing to do on behalf of the US. So this, this is, I think, the long-term issue, that how the US has never had to deal with a great power or a would-be great power the size of India, which is also a democracy, albeit a faltering democracy at the moment, but still a democracy, and one that is growing now very well. I mean, if you go to India now, you get a completely different sense about the confidence of the people than even 2 or 3 years ago. It's a different India now. And I think part of it is, with all credit to this government, is the way they have been able to implement some of the very large public programs, the water program, the UPI program, the health program, the insurance program. In fact, at RAND, we are starting a very interesting project on the cross-fertilization effects. How has universal payments interface affected labor markets in India? How do scale effects occur? How do network effects occur? It's a very important question for the Indian government that we are working on. So, given that it's clear that, 10 years down the road, India's ambition to be a great power will be close to being realized, if not realized. There's still a long way to go. I mean, I was just looking at GDP numbers. Although the growth rate in India is much more, in absolute terms, China is actually catching up with the US. Over the last 7-8 years, China's GDP has grown by about 10 trillion. The US's GDP has grown by about 7 trillion. So, the absolute gap, if not the percentage gap, has reduced. During the same period, India's GDP went from 2 trillion to 3 trillion, just 1 trillion change. So, in absolute terms, India is falling further back. So it needs to get its economic game in order, which it will do. I feel fairly confident in saying that. So then the question is, how is the US to deal with another great economic power? And that's a very difficult question to answer. It's not ever been experienced before. The efforts to try and, the Ukraine war showed that the efforts to do it in the usual American way, saying, we're a democracy, we understand what's good for you, it doesn't work with India. And it's not that a democracy will make it much easier. If you look back to the 1980s, when Japan and the US clashed about economic growth, the US was quite willing to paint Japan in the worst possible terms. I'm going to read you a quote. So one American candidate for president said in 1989, Japan has systematically sucked the blood out of America. In 2015, the same candidate said, China has sucked the blood out of the United States. Any guesses on who that candidate is? Trump, right? He was a candidate then. But, Reagan said things like, at that time, this is not fair trade when they steal our intellectual property. Lighthizer, who was the trade negotiator even then, called China, Japan a currency manipulator and holding an outsized trade surplus, IP thief, state-sponsored industrial policy, and a soft authoritarian. Now, this is to a country that they have an alliance with. So, I think this is very important, and I really feel that people like this crowd, which played such an important role in getting the nuclear suppliers agreement with the US approved, should think about this issue and think, how do we make sure that as India grows in power, that the US doesn't start to view India as a rival. The chances of it being viewed as a rival are not small, in my opinion. So, yeah, I've been seeing the signs, so I should wrap up in a minute or so. So if I was to describe the US-India relationship now, I would say it's like chocolate with chili sauce in it, or the chili chocolate, basically smooth and creamy, but with a hint of spice. So yeah, let me wrap up with that, and should I take questions from here, Margaret? Take questions? Okay, thanks very much. Yeah. All right, open for questions. There's some hands up here. I think one at the back there, and then Arun.
You mentioned that Congress wanted India to join NATO. That I didn't know about it. Is it a kind of a strong position that US has, that India should join NATO, or
it's not a government, not the Biden administration's position. It was a vote by the House that India should be invited to join it. I mean, the House votes on many things just to send a signal rather than, actual policy. But, India took it poorly. They said these people are naive. They don't understand. If you hear Jaishankar on it, he said something like, whenever there's a problem, the Americans look on it in a defense perspective. This is not a defense issue, Question. Yeah, please, give it here and then there.
Well, this is a slightly macro level question, which is after the Second World War, with the Atlantic Charter, the formation of the United Nations, there was some sense that all the countries of the world should come together and talk about a peace that benefits everybody. The last time such conversation occurred was under Kennedy. When he spoke again, he said he wants world peace, not a Pax Americana that's forced on others, but really, and Kishore Mahbubani has written about this just last week. Today, however, politics has become so local. It's like the Indian leadership has to cater to certain elements, their constituencies, which have become more and more extreme. The United States also, over the last several years, we've seen, the extreme ends of the distribution often pushing where policy is. So where do you think all this is going? Do you think, and how does it affect the US-India relationship, most importantly?
Yeah, no, it's a very good point that the US in some ways to us appears increasingly dysfunctional, unable to take serious decisions, unable to make sure that wealth transfers across generations are protected. You can see what policy on climate change is. The US technically on paper has a very strong policy of supporting climate change mitigation. But if you look at what the actual funds flows are, the commitment to developing countries that they would give jointly with other developed countries, 100 billion a year, its actual amount is less than 5 billion. And the US is the biggest defaulter on that. So I think, we have a situation, we have many dysfunctional great economies, the US being one, China another. The hope is that India will not fall into that trap. But either way, it will challenge the relationship between the two. Yeah, there's some this side you had some.
Hi, Rafiq. What would be purely on the on the economic front, right? What would be the top 3 things that you would recommend to the team in Delhi, the Modi team in Delhi, what are the top three things that we need to grab as this unprecedented window of opportunity opens up between US and India? What do we do? Would it be, creation of a big manufacturing supply chain sector? How do we grab the chips opportunity? Do we partner on, on climate? What do you think are those three, just economic front?
From an India perspective, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, from an India perspective, I think India's great power status depends a lot on its ability to be the champion of the global south. This is a position for which it competes for actively with China. China, because it's much wealthier, has been able to devote significantly more resources, the Belt and Road Initiative or the health initiatives in Africa. I would say the key thing that the US should accept in looking at it in the spirit of collaboration is outsource, in a way, the management of global south relations of the US to India. So that, on behalf of the US and India, a lot can be done for countries, poor countries in Africa, in terms of infrastructure, systems, governance. What China is doing on its own, which the US cannot do on its own because it's basically not competitive in infrastructure, but India is, and growing more so. So I would say that would be my number one priority for Modi's ask. That let us be your partner, be a real partner. We have our ambition, the global south, some countries more than others. Let's work together on that. So I would say that would be my first recommendation. The second one I would say is on the human rights front. The US has a summit for democracy, which is kind of hypocritical. Some countries which are hardly genuine democracies get invited. I think human rights has to be a stronger pillar of US policy. I think Obama put it well when he criticized some human rights activities in India. He was asked, why are you criticizing? Don't you want to build a friendship? He said, friends criticize each other. It's only strangers or people who have bad intentions don't. Now, it's not clear that India will react well to criticism. But look at the state of media freedom in India. It's terrible. So how to address that in a way that is good for India without seeming overbearing would, I think, be my second point. And the third would be, India has Asia ambitions. So it knows if it's to be a great power, it must also come close to the countries of Southeast Asia and East Asia. The US can do a lot to help that. It doesn't. It views itself as the hub and everyone else as a spoke. So it has a bilateral relationship with Japan, a bilateral relationship with Korea, but it doesn't want the three to talk together. Except now there are some moves to do that at some risk, right? If you see Japan spending 2% of its GDP on defense, what does that mean for Japan down the road? It sort of will feel much more independent from the US. So the sense that, yes, let's create a partnership rather than just be the hub and all these being spokes, would, I think, be very useful. And, in that context, the Indo-Pacific strategy of the US needs a lot of change to accommodate for that. So those would be my top three.
Hi, I'm Arvind with Soft Type, but my question is a very simple one. The world's biggest battlefield is 1 million troops, both nuclear armed, facing each other across the India-Pakistan border. You didn't mention Pakistan at all. It's a failing state, at least in my opinion. Somehow there'll be some strategic interactions that will be important. Jai Shankar's view is that Pakistan is irrelevant, but as Henry Kissinger, our 100-year-old, not even octogenarian, said a long time ago that we have a tilt towards Pakistan. Of course, that tilt is now gone, but can you say something about how that will strategically play out? Thank you.
Yeah, I did discuss Pakistan. I said India spent the first 10 years of this century thinking about how to dehyphenate from Pakistan. Yeah, my view on the relations is Pakistan is doing a unfortunately, I think, a fine job of making itself irrelevant to either its neighbors and the world, both of them. And with some risk, of course, because it's nuclear armed. But neither Pakistan nor India has a strategic culture that encourages the use of nuclear weapons. So my sense is that's a manageable risk. The only thing that could get it out of management is if China played some adverse role. I don't see that happening. So I think it's really up to Pakistan to prove its relevance. For that, it has to solve its internal problems, get back to growth. And that's going to take time and effort. So that's my view.
This week, Washington Senator Warner, chairman of the Intelligence Committee, he pointed out that there are more Chinese troops on the Indian border than there are Russian troops in Ukraine.
Oh, really? Anita had a question.
Thanks, Rafiq. India and the US has actually been flirting with India for many decades, and it seems like the dance has begun. My question to you is, will this dance get consummated? We're all eagerly looking to be in the lawns of the White House and hear some announcement next week. So what is your intel on this?
The US has been flirting with India, yes. India's view would be they've been trifling with it, which is an anagram of flirting, by the way. So, I think what we can expect, see, Modi wants to push the G20 right now. It's good for his re-election prospects. He wants to make climate change a centerpiece of the G20's activities. APEC is coming up. India is not in that. He's concerned about that. I don't think we'll see much change in these issues. One is, APEC is kind of an irrelevant organization, frankly, even though they're coming to San Francisco. Ever since the World Trade Organization came in 2001, 1995, APEC lost its relevance, and particularly when China joined in 2001. And then Clinton changed it to being a summit thing. So that's one. G20, again, because China is there, the US is not interested in the G20. So in terms of big initiatives, these are the ones that Modi cares about. I don't think US is particularly interested right now in the global south either. So I think we have to push for those things, but I don't think you'll see those being announced. The announcements will probably be much more symbolic, looking ahead. Yeah, I'm always suspicious of meetings which end in looking ahead. Should look back also. Yeah. It'll all be initiatives, right? Nothing that we have done. Yeah.
Much didn't happen for a long time, but there was an agreement that, okay, now we're together on this. And I don't think it's completely, there were 4 things that had to happen. Not all 4 have been done yet. I don't think the nuclear supply group has yet
They have
been done.
not, yeah.
So sometimes these movements forward are important.
Fair enough. Question here?
Rafiq, since you're from RAND, I can't hesitate to ask this question. You touched on something which lies at the fundamental core of the contradiction or dichotomy in this issue, which is you mentioned the multipolarity versus, you did not use the word, but US hegemony.
Unipolarity.
Unipolarity, these are fundamental tenets of the strategies of the 2 countries. There is total consensus in India that the new international order or multipolarity has to be multipolar. US national defense strategy came out under Mathis, but it's got everybody online, says that we cannot afford or will ever admit anybody to come close to anything being a pole. So that's a very, very fundamental difference. How can you dance?
So, I tried to bring that out by saying that living with a bigger great power, in a sense, population and so on, is going to be a challenge for the US. And they'll have to give up some goals.
should also look at the context. So the US
and the belief that China would essentially become part of a whatever system, a rules-based system, if you might. No, well, whatever, there was some common rules of the road.
Yeah, I think the US.
Now the
yeah.
change has been, the national security strategy says the United States will outcompete and contain China. That's what the goal is.
Well, they're not using the word contain.
They use kind of...
But yeah, no, I agree with you that it's going to be a very difficult one. Okay, I think I need to wrap it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rafiq, for that amazing overview and for warming up our audience. We can see this is going to be a very active audience. Please get your questions in early because this is just, the pace is just going to pick up as we go throughout the afternoon.